Are you aspiring to become a pilot? Not any kind of pilot. The ones who enjoy this amazing outside view. Yes, that's right, glorious shades of white and gray. We're talking about the instrument-rated pilot. Here I will share how I would plan to go about this pilot training process differently if I had the chance to do it all over again. You really don't have to repeat all the mistakes I made. I hope you don't. Nah, I know you won't. And the studying never ends. It's true. The overwhelming amount of information was discouraging. Tons of new navigation charts, rules and procedures, and let's not even get started in counting how many acronyms there are. I felt like I had to learn flying all over again. An instrument was heavy with studying combined with learning to stay oriented in disorienting conditions. Literally. What would have helped me in minimizing unnecessary feelings of being discouraged was to stay loyal to the Airman Certification Standards, or ACS. Doing so would have helped me systematically track and progress my training. If you aim to take the practical exam in the future, this is the one and only guide that will help you stay on track in preparation for the test. The ACS is available free in PDF on the FAA website at faa.gov. By the way, always make sure you have the most current version since the ACS could have items added or removed with each update. I boxed and read the 2 areas you can check to see the status of these publications. I would use the ACS like a checklist for all the areas I would need to study and practice towards preparing to take the practical exam. I go a bit more in detail about how I would do this in my top 5 check ride tips video if you would like to see a simple demonstration on that method I use. Remember that during the practical exam, the examiner will not test you on a matter that's not included in the ACS. So though there's plenty of great information and skills that are related to instrument flying, not everything will be included in the testing in order to get instrument rated. This can help you with identifying and prioritizing what's relevant to your goal and what to focus on if doing well and passing the practical exam is your intention. You may already know that for the instrument rating, there's another written test included. If you're already a private pilot, then you would be familiar with the first-time experience of taking a written test. The FAA uses the same number of questions, time given to complete the test, and same minimum passing score of 70%. So the testing procedure for the instrument rating will be the same as you experienced before for your private pilot. Studying preferences and experience may differ from person to person. When it comes to preparing for written tests, I have been buying test preparation books with question banks to practice from. I have studied this way for more written tests than I would like to admit, though in a way it did work. I was able to pass each exam like this. However, I would never use this method again in the future. So if I were to go back and take another written test, I would not hesitate to go to Shepherd Air. Shepherd Air is an online study program that you may have already heard of because I certainly did, but I still insisted on sticking with studying the books. And now I feel dumb. As a student, I prioritized saving money as much as I could towards the flight training portion. Saving money itself is not what I'm regretting here. It is the inefficient, penny-pinching habits that I got myself into, and it really didn't help me out in this area. I have taken my last 2 written tests using this program, and I was so impressed with how efficient this program was designed comparing to my own book study method. And for the value in their subscriptions, it was not that expensive. I think it was well worth it. With Shepherd Air, I definitely noticed I saved a lot of time, was much more prepared for the test, and ultimately got almost perfect scores, all with what felt like less effort compared to studying my books. This could be another example of studying smarter, not harder. Their program is more on the self-directed study style, where it's more about exposing you to the questions as much as possible, including a brief yet clear explanation for each answer. They even catch and warn about odd questions. But this is not a full ground lesson course that is integrated with the practice written test questions. If you prefer a full explanation and a lesson on each question topic, I'm not sure if Shepherd Air would suit your preferences here. Doing so would be just as ineffective as taking a written test preparation book and trying to learn from it how to fly an airplane. I was all over the place when it came to reading to learn about instrument flying. Because I definitely didn't take my own advice on sticking with the ACS for studying, I would look to read anything and everything about instrument flying. Of course, I let myself feel scattered in my knowledge. feeling like I understood a lot, but I was also clueless in many areas too. Also, I had multiple books I was using to study, so they all overlapped with information here and there. So I would be reading on the same subjects over, which we could call this a good review in a way, but it's not effective all the time. So overall, this lack of structure in my study made my progress questionable. I mean, it made my progress questionable? With a question mark. I would make sure to make my efforts trackable next time by referring to the ACS as a guide on what to study instead of picking up any book that had a cool looking cover. I mean looked relevant. Let's take a quick look at what the FAA has to offer for instrument information. For starters, they have the Instrument Flying Handbook and the Instrument Procedures Handbook. And yes, you guessed it, they have a free PDF on their website for both of these. In a way, I compare the Instrument Flying Handbook to the more private pilot equivalent Airplane Flying Handbook, and the Instrument Procedures Handbook to the private pilot equivalent Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. I make this somewhat strange comparison with these books because I felt that if you benefited well from the Airplane Flying Handbook and the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge during your private pilot training, these instrument handbooks may feel similar to their layout and content to the next flying level. This was true in my own case. My quick summary of the Instrument Flying Handbook includes that I did find some helpful sections here, but I had a few disadvantages. The main issue was that it had a lot of areas that discusses topics that are related to glass cockpits and electronic displays in general. This did not apply to the cockpit setups I was in, and it becomes more difficult to relate to the book when a lot of the instrument flying techniques and scans are customized to each cockpit. This book was probably created in a very general purpose to introduce some instrument flying. In my experience, I felt a good portion of this book would be best learned and practiced in actual flight lessons and a more hands-on approach with the aircraft you are training in. Now over to the Instrument Procedures Handbook, I feel like I should have focused more on this book instead of the Instrument Flying Handbook as I did before. When it came to studying, I was in more need of learning all the rules, the charts, procedures, and systems for instrument flying. This book had quite a few explanations that I found to be helpful in putting things together and making sense of all the bits of information. Regardless of my brief summaries, I know there may be opportunities for students to find good help from any book, so don't forget to at least get a preview of these books on the FAA website, as the FAA does put out a lot of good and organized information in their collection of handbooks and manuals. One last book I want to include mentioning. This one is not an FAA publication, but I found this one to be very valuable. Everything Explained for the Professional Pilot by Richie Langell. Its statements on the cover summarizes pretty well what this book contains. I found this incredibly helpful for interpreting a lot of the instrument regulations and rules. I very often have used this one in conjunction with the FAR AIM because the FAR AIM sometimes sounds too legal and tricky to make sense of how a rule actually applies to pilots. I found that the information in here was increasingly helpful for pilots instrument rated and above, including commercial, instructors, and ATP as well. I didn't hear about a safety pilot until I started instrument training. I participated in this kind of flying a little bit, but I found that this could be beneficial for an instrument student in various ways. If you're at a flight school that has a community that brings opportunities like this and you are qualified, that could be to your benefit. I felt like my school was on the smaller side, so it was a bit more rare to encounter the need for safety pilots on a regular basis. I was fortunate though to meet some students who were also at similar stages in training as myself, and we took turns in sitting in the backseat of the aircraft while observing the other person do their practice approaches with an instructor. This helped to mentally process the situations and steps to be taken when you are observing and not the one busy constantly managing every action. Doing both simultaneously can make a new student feel overloaded at the beginning. Some people do better studying in groups, while others prefer to do so independently. Whichever is your best learning style, a support group can be a strong asset to a training environment. And I was surprised at how the aviation community in general was more willing to help and share their knowledge with each other. A few more tips that would have been useful in my own practice in getting over the learning plateau during my instrument training. The flight school I was at happened to not have a flight simulator, but there are a few advantages in a setup like this during certain situations. For example, if there's difficulty specifically in the procedural functions of instrument flying, such as setting up for an approach, a simulator could help maximize the number of times you could repeat the practice of setting up the approach in a given amount of time. You could pause and reset the aircraft position for approach one after another, while if in the actual flight, you would have to complete the entire course around. I think a simulator could be a helpful tool for some students with these kinds of training needs. Though paying for a simulator is not always necessary either, you may have also heard of chair flying. Again, with instrument being particularly demanding when it comes to flows, patterns, and procedures, repeated practice is the only way to get smoother with the operation. I used to also sit in parked planes that weren't being used and go through the checklists and practices myself. Occasionally, I would also turn on the master switch briefly to practice familiarizing myself with the avionics for setting up and loading approaches and such. Make sure to be quick and not run down the battery while doing this. Speaking of practicing with avionics, depending on the equipment you have in your own training aircraft, I would do a curious search on whether the manufacturer of your equipment may provide any support or training resources for their products. Garmin, for example, has various classes and YouTube tutorials and manuals available to learn how to use their equipment. Some of them offer a simulator to download onto a compatible computer system as well. I happened to find some information that helped me learn some new functions on their website. If you happen to be less accustomed to ATC communications, being daunted by the task is not uncommon. We often recommend listening to their frequency, and liveatc.net is one way to do it. Though it may not always focus on IFR communications alone, I remember that keeping up with ATC during instrument flying was more involving than I remember for VFR experiences. IFR has tested and challenged me in almost every aspect of being a pilot. It was exciting, though, to finally be able to understand everything said, including the IFR language, on the radios. I want to emphasize that by now, there's a significant increase in the amount of free information out there on the internet. I would definitely make use of the availability of this where it's effective. At the same time, we often get what we pay for, so there may be a lot of filtering needed to get to accurate and helpful information. However, as a pilot, you would know to always confirm and cross-check your information for absolute accuracy, as much as possible. For private to ATP and everything in between, that practice doesn't change much. Overall, though, the experience and demands of training to become instrument rated was in many ways similar to training to become a private pilot. So this familiarity would be to your advantage. Practice is going to be the main theme for these endeavors, and it's not practice for absolute perfection, but practice for safety on a consistent basis.